Welcome to Integrated. This is the podcast where we seek to grow knowledge of God by coming to know ourselves and what we are made for. By bridging the gap between the intellect and the will, we have the capacity to understand our nature and grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. My name is Angela Erickson, and this is my trusty sidekick, Veronica. She's just going to be a forever staple on my show, I think, but really excited for you to be joining me today. There are a couple things I want to talk about before I jump into this interview that I'm sharing with you. So the first thing is, please like, share, hit subscribe. Huge thank you to those of you who did publish a review on my on Apple Podcasts for my podcast, because honestly, I can't tell you or stress enough how much of a difference that makes. Especially when you don't have a lot of reviews. Any one negative review, which I've had a couple, and I'm not sure if that's related to people feeling like I don't do a great job on my podcast, in which case I just would like to know what that is, so I can I'd like constructive feedback. It's very helpful to me. But if you love the show, I also love that too. My love language is definitely words of affirmation. So I love seeing what some of you guys are saying about the podcast. It really means a lot to me. So the more reviews that I get, then kind of the less those negative reviews sort of pull my numbers back down. So it actually, like, I can't tell you, that helped me a lot. Thank you so much. And so anyway, next thing I want to talk about is the series that I'll be doing on the meaning of Catholic. So every other Tuesday night, starting, next Tuesday. So that will be our first episode, really getting into things, will be November 15th, I believe 6:30 p.m. Make sure you're subscribed to the Meaning of Catholic channel, but I'll be talking with Haley Martin. Some of you are familiar with her and the stuff she does moderating for the Meaning of Catholic and every other really awesome Catholic channel, it seems like. We're going to be talking about some of the controversial issues of the day within the church. And our show is called The Ascent, wherein we ascend to the teachings of the church. And the goal is to ascend. So it's not a perfect double entendre, but the goal is to ascend to heaven, right? Like to have that eternal perspective, and speak in a way that is charitable, where we can be agreeable in our disagreements. So this upcoming week, we will be discussing the liturgy. I will be speaking in favor of the traditional Latin Mass, and she will be defending the Novus Ordo. And I think it's going to be a good conversation. So please join me over there for that, 6:30. If I'm remembering correctly. I'll definitely publish on social media as well, so we can make sure we get the exact time. But next week, Tuesday, and I hope that you'll join me. Next, I will be taking Advent off from the podcast. So November will kind of be the last of my season 1. Kind of exciting for me to be able to say that. I'm looking at season 2 and getting some interviews lined up as I come into the new year. But I want to take Advent off to really focus on my website, some writing, and praying more. Really embracing the penitential aspect of Advent as we prepare for Christmas. So maybe I'll pre-record some things to publish more in line with meditation and prayer, contemplation, that kind of a thing, focused on the season. But for now, just know I won't be publishing interviews over there. I will, however, continue doing my stuff over on the Meaning of Catholic in the meantime. So make sure you follow me over there. I just, can't do it all right now. So anyway, back to the subject of today. I interviewed my friend. I'm grateful to call her friend now, Melody Lyons. I interviewed her earlier in the season on her journey of healing. She has this book called The Sunshine Principle, Honoring God's Design for Healing. Really great book. I definitely recommend you get it if you are interested in more natural, holistic care, and approaching our bodies with an understanding that God designed our bodies to heal. And so how do we do that in a way that doesn't, how do we help our bodies heal in a way that doesn't help big pharma or like people make money on us, treating us as more as a product. So anyway, great episode. Today we talked about the language of occultism. I did my last interview with Therese Piccola talking about occult and how there's such a hankering for it right now, I think, in a secular way around this time of year. But really, I also am noticing a lot of women, especially women who are into natural holistic care, um, and pregnancy, really embracing these pagan ideas. And I think, things like yoga have a lot to do with that, and embracing sort of this mindset, and these pagan ideals. And so we talk about that. We talk about Melody's experience with yoga, and manifesting, how we depersonalize God a lot of the time when we start embracing pagan ideas, and just the language that's used, and perhaps why it seems maybe that women are more susceptible to this than men. So we really talk about a lot of different things, and I will definitely be having her on to talk about St. Hildegard sometime, hopefully in season 2. We'll dive into that, as a matter of another issue. So really excited. This was a great interview. I feel like Melanie and I could have talked all day. And thankfully for you, our listeners, we did not. But but anyway, great interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Please share it, especially if you have friends and family that are into yoga and the occult. So if they're doing Reiki and chakras and manifesting and doing all kinds of pagan things, even if they think that these are totally legitimate Christian practices, just low key let them know that maybe this is not a good idea for them in their spiritual lives. So, again, don't forget to subscribe, hit like, share this episode. And if you are open to, please consider becoming a patron. I know that times are tough right now, for all of us. We're all feeling it. And it seems like we're going to continue to feel it in light of this midterm election. So we also are feeling it, and anything that you guys can do, even $5 a month, if you've been enjoying this podcast, to help offset the costs and make sure that this podcast can continue on. I would just so appreciate your help. I just feel like this has been a great community, and I've loved getting to know so many of you guys. So I'm very grateful to you. But I hope that you enjoy this interview with Melody Lyons on the language of the occult. Hi, Melody. Thanks for coming back on to Integrated. I'm so excited to have you here to talk about this really, I think it's really relevant right now issue, but a lot of people aren't seeing it. So again, thanks for coming on to talk about kind of how occultism is seeping into Catholicism and Christianity in general.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to dive into it. It's really a touchy subject. And I now have some adult children, and I can just see, like, when I talk about this stuff, it's no longer just theoretical or for my friends or just because I want to hear myself talk, but I'm like, I really want to be able to, help form and guide those young people who are so precious to me and my grandchildren. I have a grandbaby now, so.
Oh yeah, congratulations! Your granddaughter, correct?
Yeah.
She's very fresh. She's a fresh little babe.
She is.
Yeah. Oh, I'm beautiful. She had a lot of hair too. Am I remembering right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, you've got that right.
Yeah. So, and this is speaking of babies. Veronica is always trying to get the limelight. She's gonna be a natural.
She is. She's precious.
Yeah, she thinks she's in on this conversation right now. So, your background, I think, is partly just your background. You have a lot of experience, kind of dabbling in some of the occult and some of these things that lead Christians wayward a little bit, and one of those things being yoga, which is kind of one of I get the most pushback on yoga than almost any other topic when I talk about it on Twitter and social media. And I would love to pick your brain. Like, why is that? Because I want to talk about some of these things like yoga, and then also the language that is being used to sort of paganize Christianity. You see the syncretism going on, but yoga just seems to me like the most prominent, obvious gateway where people don't really realizing that they may be engaging in the occult, and they will defend it to the death. So why is that, do you think?
Well, I think my experience with the occult, there was never a point at which I was saying putting myself in that box. I was not saying I'm part of the occult. You know, I'm new age. Uh, all that I had in my head and in my soul and in my life was just sort of soaked in, you know, especially as a young person, especially as a kid, you just sort of become a sponge. And those things which are surrounding you and your family culture and your school culture and the media, all of those things you're consuming and they become a part of your lived experience. People don't necessarily see the way that they live as being a cult, and so it's
Right.
very personal. If you're mentioning yoga and saying, you know, well, yoga's part of the occult and it's Hinduism and New Age, and you probably shouldn't do it. A person hears, you know, your occult, your New Age, and especially if you're talking to a Christian or Catholic, they're going to be defensive about that, you know, of course. Like, well, wait a minute. No, I'm not. This thing that I'm doing is not those things, because we have an idea of what it means to be involved in the occult. So I think it just evokes a personal response because it feels like a personal attack.
That's a really good point. And I think we are all on high alert, I think, right now with some of the infighting that we're seeing already between some very, very, very rad trad Catholics versus some of the more liberal Catholics. But anyone can fall into this because, like you said, a lot of people, you become kind of inoculated.
Yes, that's a good word for it.
And I think, it reminds me a lot of feminism. Like a lot of Catholics really hold feminist views because they don't truly understand feminism because they were sort of inoculated. They just sort of grew up in this environment where it was seeped into how they view the world. So, how did you come out of yoga then and realize kind of what it was? Sorry, again for calling.
You're fine. It's like the perfect backdrop, Catholic mothers. Well, so the funny thing is about yoga is that I never really cared for it because I was never very good at it. It was really challenging for me. I just wasn't very stretchy. And but I was immersed in the lifestyle and in the belief system which encompassed yoga. So all of the goals of yoga, which you know, I just to speak plainly, to
Mm-hmm.
practice yoga is to practice elements of Hinduism and New Age. Like, there's no way around that.
There's no way around that because a lot of people
No.
will try and separate the two, and we split the baby a
Yeah.
little bit, pun intended, I guess, with
Eh,
the baby. But it just seems to me like those things are part of the nature of yoga. It's part of its own essence because it is religious by
it
nature.
is. It is. And some people, well, many people will say like yoga isn't a religion. The same argument is used to say that Hinduism isn't actually like a religion, but it doesn't actually have to be a religion in order to be spiritual and also to be spiritually disordered. And this is just a side note, but interestingly, to me anyway, yoga means to be yoked to, or like spiritual union. And also the word religion actually means to bind. So, like, to bind to God.
Mm.
And the practice is just innately spiritual. And even if somebody isn't entering into it with that intention, it's like, you know, if somebody's entering into a chapel and there's Eucharistic adoration or a Catholic mass, I mean, you can say that person is not really attending or praying. That's probably true sometimes, even for Catholics.
Yeah.
But is it inherently spiritual? Oh, yeah, it certainly is. So, um, the the yoga was a part of my lived experience. My community was doing it, and I was practicing the belief system, which yoga was supposed to be elevating. So
Yeah,
the
yeah,
goal
explain
with
that a
yoga,
little bit more
yeah,
because it's not just the exercises and the stretches is what
no,
you're saying. Like there's more to this. I mean, even for someone as you claim yourself maybe wasn't good at the actual stretches and poses and everything.
right.
But you were living this lifestyle. So explain that a little bit too because it's so interesting. Like I just find that people who go into yoga and really start doing it a lot, it has this cultist with it, right? Like
It
there
does.
there's so much more than that, but I can't exactly put my finger on it. But it does seem to change how people perceive and interact with the world around them.
It definitely does, because the goal of yoga is not just to get a yoga body. the ultimate goal of yoga is different.
To wear yoga pants?
It's to wear yoga pants, yeah. And, you know, the movements themselves do not constitute yoga. And they're actually, for those people who say that you can't do any of the movements that you find in yoga, they're actually like something like 1,500 different movements that have been incorporated into yoga. So to actually, and that includes like yawning, blinking, breathing, you know. So the movements themselves don't constitute yoga, and actually should not be called yoga when used in isolation. But when used in the context of yoga, however, you know, other practices from Hinduism, Buddhism, or the New Age movement are integrated into it. And most people just don't understand the roots and purpose, and therefore they don't understand everything they're participating in. All yoga instructors are instructed in the spiritual aspects of yoga. And that's anything from, you know, because it's not like there was yoga one day, somebody invented it, and it's been the same through all
Right.
the centuries. There has been development, but the root of it still contains all of this, this spiritual orientation. You've got polytheism, you've got monism, like there's this belief that all things in the universe are one without any distinction. That's actually a really, that for me was very important. Reincarnation, karma, idol worship, one's divine identity, right? And involved in that, there's all kinds of these techniques, the movements, the hand positioning, the you know, the Sanskrit, the mantras, the different things that seem innocent or innocuous to people who don't understand. They're not. You know, there's all kinds of like, and the further you go, you get into like dietary guidelines, different bodily purification techniques. You've got really bizarre like breath techniques, which are actually can be kind of dangerous, but they're all oriented towards elevating you spiritually. So becoming, coming into union with like the universal consciousness, basically.
So kind of on that note, you know, I remember, gosh, it must have been a couple of years ago. I started doing quite a bit of research into yoga and some of the famous yogi masters and things like that. And it seems to me that yoga also has quite a history of it's a very sexualized religion, probably because of that union aspect and trying to become unified with everything in creation. And that would sort of, I mean, it's not surprising then that maybe you'd have a lot of orgies and things like that, and yogi masters taking advantage of women and things like that. How much do you know about that, and what are your thoughts on that? Because it seems almost as if that is an integral part of it. The breathing, you get hot yoga, like it's intended to induce a sort of sexual state within people who are practicing.
Yeah, and I never was into those things, just to be clear.
Yeah.
But I think especially when anytime you step outside of the parameters of Christianity and into an entirely different worldview and moral framework, you're going to open yourself up to all of that. I think I'll just describe my experience. And one thing that people should know is that all of these techniques lead ultimately to this spiritual practice of striving to become immersed in the divine. And so, especially when people are unmoored and also tangling with the demonic and don't even realize it, I think you're going to get into some really, the further you go into it, you can get in some really heavy, maybe nasty stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And being immersed in the divine, that does not mean the same thing as how Christians strive to be united to Christ through relationship. It's different. But because we don't have a grasp on the language, even of our faith, it's all can be very confusing and sound Christian even when it's not. So, you know, like yoga, you're seeking to actually become part of the divine, like this vast universal soup where you just disappear into nothingness and also everything all at once.
Did you ever have any intense spiritual experiences while you were doing yoga?
Not with yoga, because again, I think I was distracted by the fact that I couldn't do it. But the meditation that I preferred, and this was the goal of yoga, and this is what I knew about yoga. I even had when I was a child, I even had like a book of poses And the poses were all oriented toward like the spiritual. It wasn't, this is beneficial for, whatever muscles of your body or stretching. They were all spiritual poses. And so somebody who is more into yoga could, enter into that kind of meditation. For me, that meditation came in different ways. And I used to meditate for that reason. I desired to be nothing and everything. And I had these spiritual experiences while meditating that were so incredible that it led me just to seek it out more and more. I became almost, because life is really hard, sometimes, and especially as a youngster. And I became almost desperate to be done with the limitations of life, because the goal was to be beyond the physical. And the experience were almost like a drug. And I wanted to return to them again and again and achieve that feeling that I had. And so yoga done perfectly involves merging into that universal consciousness, just a freeing from the bonds of the earth and experiencing this unity. But it's a demonic unity. And so it just can't lead to a good place, because, Christ says, I see you, like uniquely you were created as a unique person whom I love. Hinduism and the New Age lead a person to just desire this universal immersion in which they become literally a non-person, divine, but not distinct, just becoming part of the whole. And Christianity sees the unique individual. So the language in between is really where it gets dangerous for people, because you can end up sliding into the truly, it's a demonic side of that with vague
created
language.
A lot of discontentment in your own life.
Oh, absolutely. I actually, and this isn't the sole reason for it, but at that time in my life, I reached a point of despair. And I believed that if I ended my life, I would be reincarnated. And because I was free of that fear of like hell or, the last things, I just thought, okay, well, maybe this might be like a cheater method, and maybe I might come back like not as elevated a being as I might if I just stuck it out. Like, had all these rationalizations, but I just don't think I can do this anymore. And I want to be free of the bonds of this body. I was enslaved by my body. I hated myself. I just like, and every experience that I had of meditation would just like, it drew me further and further in that direction, where I was like, I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave this. I don't want to go back to my body. And so,
and that's really interesting too. Yeah, I was going to say, because, you hear of the saints having these mystical experiences, and of course, many of them wanted to return to that, but it didn't throw them into full-blown despair that I am aware of, because that's not a Christian virtue. We have hope and joy and things like that. And usually those mystical experiences leave a lingering effect that brings more virtue into our lives. Like, instead of the opposite, you don't see so much of that despairing, and that desire to sort of end it all. What do you think about that?
Well, the obvious reason is because the one is oriented towards self, and the other is oriented towards Christ.
Right.
And so the Christian meditation is obviously an important part of our Catholic tradition. The saints practice meditation. Sometimes people get they're like, oh, meditation, I don't want to meditate. But that's because our culture has taught us what meditation is.
Right.
And
it should be informed by our faith.
Absolutely. And so we have a deep tradition of Christian meditation, but it's not empty. So we never empty our minds in order to come closer to Christ. We calm our minds in order to be filled with the presence of Christ. And that's completely different. So that orientation, if we are just focusing in on ourselves, and also I would say specifically with occult, New Age, or yoga meditation, we're opening ourselves up literally to demonic, because we are not focused on the presence of Christ. So on the one hand, there's an emptiness. Like, we cannot lead ourselves to salvation or to peace or to consolation or to hope. And so there's only despair there if it's just us. And then also if we're dealing directly with the demonic, which a lot of people, they're like, no, I'm not. But
Yeah, let's talk
you know,
about that. Why
yeah.
is it that so many, because I kind of shared with you before we came on, you're always my point person, one of my point people. I have a couple of you guys that I sort of throw things at, and I'm like, hey, is this a cult or is it not? Because I'm hyper vigilant. I had
Mhm.
some pretty intense like experiences growing up, especially as a young child, where I experienced the presence of the demonic. And
Mhm.
so I'm very, very hyper vigilant almost, I would say. I mean, even when I first heard about grounding, outside, just going out and walking barefoot, I was like, I don't know, this sounds weird to me. I don't know. I mean, even though I'm like, I get energy is real, like we experience, our bodies have electrical impulses going through them and firing, and yeah, I can understand some of this stuff, but why is it that you get someone like me who's like hyper vigilant and is afraid to even look at anything? Not because I feel like the devil is around every corner. I don't. I just see that this is a very pervasive issue, and I feel like there are so many women who are almost, it seems to be more of a woman's problem. This is another issue we can talk about next, but why is it that there's sort of the language that's used, even in Christian circles, especially Christian health circles, um, there is a lot of that occult sort of woven in, and they lose their minds if you point it out to them. Why
Mhm.
is that? How did this happen?
Oh, this is just cultural. I mean, I think it's a relatively simple explanation. I grew up secular, but in Catholic schools. So I grew up sort of in the church and also like immersed in the New Age. So there was this blend, and
Hmm.
that's just how our culture is. Language is we have a crisis of language.
Yeah, we do.
It doesn't mean much these days, and it's
No.
really difficult, especially on the internet, to try to figure out, especially with this is an entirely separate conversation,
Right.
but the challenge of evangelization, because in order to evangelize to people on a level where maybe a large number of people can understand, the common language has to be used, but oftentimes the common language is not,
You have to define
it's
terms in
it's
every
yes.
conversation.
Mhm.
Yes.
Right, and so, making that decision like, "Well, I could say this, I could post this in a way that most of the culture would understand, or I can post it with a language that is more expressive of how maybe I really feel it or think it, or maybe, like, is more accurate to how the church sees it or whatever." And that those decisions have to be made, but I think that's the primary thing. This is our culture. This is what we learn in schools. I went to Catholic schools, but the language of the culture was there. So feminism was
Right.
there and the occult and all of those things. Nobody came out and said, hey, this word I'm using right now, I got from feminism or the occult or new age or like self-help secular gurus or something like that. It's all just this enmeshment. Um,
Yeah, that's a
and
good
we're
word
we're
for it.
not
Yeah.
thinking like you and I are kind of picking it apart right now and thinking about the language and the terms, but most people don't. And
Yeah.
that's how I grew up too. It takes time and it takes attentiveness and it takes mentoring and it takes a lot of reading, listening.
Yeah, because the language really shapes the perception of the world that we have. That's why, I mean, you can go read basically the same news story, and depending on where you're looking at, you could get the same story, and it's framed completely differently, just on the language that's used. And I think it's so hard to reach out to people who. Their language is really steeped in that new age. Like I'm thinking of the divine feminine. How do
Mm.
and some of these other terms, what are some of the other terms that you see, and how do we look at them and say, and kind of differentiate, like that is an occult term, that's a very new age pagan idea, versus like, yes, as Catholics we believe in a sense of the divine, and having that within us through Christ. But like I just feel like there's it's like, is this a distinction that is not necessary, or are these distinctions that are necessary? Because there are so many Christian women getting caught up in this language, especially in the natural world, and they're finding themselves using crystals and doing chakras and like
Mhm.
all this stuff. How do these women start with Christianity and end up in this syncretistic pagan religion where they're trying to marry it to Christianity and embrace their own divine feminine right now.
Yeah, I think the biggest component culturally right now is just that there's a huge loss of Catholic sensibility. Um, just a we have a cultural sense in different communities that we have, maybe our ethnic background or our family or our faith, and I think there's a sensibility that's been lost. So if you say to somebody, the language that you're using really strikes me as occult or new age
Mm-hmm.
or feminist, that person, there's almost a likelihood that they will just have no idea what you
Mm-hmm.
mean.
Yeah, because they have no frame of
There's
reference to
no
look
frame
at
of
it.
reference. And so like growing up so I went to Catholic grade schools, I went to Catholic high school. The language that was in there was like the language of the world with some Catholic stuff mixed in. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the majority for people who were raised in the church. I think that's the majority experience. Um,
Yeah. Can you think of any examples, maybe? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, and if it
yeah.
takes a minute, that's fine. I can edit it shorter. But are there any sort of examples of language that you kind of see cropping up that's that people need to look out for and look at with a discerning eye?
Well, your example was excellent. The divine feminine. It's not that we can't talk about these things, or that it's not that no saint ever examined the aspects of God, like the feminine
Right.
aspects of God. It's that in this culture, the divine feminine, speaking in that way, means something very specific and comes from a very specific place. So when you're dealing with the stilted, very limited language of the culture, if somebody says that, it has to be said, you know what? This language is being used predominantly by this group of people, and that's
Mm-hmm.
like feminist dissidents within the church, and also those feminists who are spiritual and into all kinds of paganism and Wicca and all that stuff outside of the church. And a lot of times there is an uncomfortable crossover between those two.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's an excellent example. I would also say like a lot of the self-help girl boss type of language. I think we talked previously about manifesting,
Yes,
right?
let's talk about that because
Yeah.
that's another it seems like it's really grown in popularity over the last, I don't know, I'd say 5 years or so, where all of a sudden everyone's talking about manifesting.
Yeah.
I know Megan Fox and her if anyone pays attention to that. Sometimes I don't know why I do, mostly because I think it's insightful to watch how these celebrities are you know leading their lives and there's so many people paying attention to them. You're
Yeah.
like, this is so dangerous. And they're she and her boyfriend Machine Gun Kelly are like drinking each other's blood, and she
Yeah.
claims she manifested him from the time she was 4 and whatever. It's like, can you explain that? Because I could see that as also being another area where Christian women are, it sort of reminds me of like the prosperity gospel type thing. Like, you do this,
Mhm.
you tell God to do this thing, and he will bring it to fruition instead of having um, the humility to surrender and assent to his will for your life. What do you
Yeah.
think about that?
I think the most important question to ask anybody who's using the word is, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say this word? And we can't always ask people that.
Mm-hmm.
But when I see it, all the little red flags go off. It could mean anything from, I am thinking positively. And so because I have a positive frame of mind, like mindset is a big thing right now, because my mindset is positive, things are more likely to go well in my life because I will behave in a way that's consistent with that positive
Mm-hmm.
attitude. So, on the one end of the spectrum, it could be just simply that. On the other end of the spectrum, you literally have people believing that they are making something happen
Yeah,
in like a magical, um in a magical way. I'll just stick with
right.
magic. Like, people don't want to talk about that term, but because everything's about energy, but I
Yeah.
think it needs to be used more. because
But the
there's
people
such a
really
confusion.
practicing, they know it's magic. I mean, I think of like my kids
Yeah.
lately, they're in this thing where every time we come up to the stoplight, they're like, go or change, change, change. And they say it
Yes.
over and over and over again. And then it finally changes. They're like, Mom, I did that. No, sweetheart, you
You
didn't.
didn't, right? I know. Yeah.
You know,
I
and
remember being a kid and thinking I could control the
yeah,
stoplights and
isn't
people,
that
right?
so funny?
Yeah.
And it's like, it sort of feels like that. Like it's like they never grew out of that. They're still yelling at the stoplight to change, and then it changes inevitably, and they're like, "Oh, I did that."
Yeah,
Or
and that was
maybe maybe there is a demonic component, you know? I mean, maybe
there's
they're
both.
yeah,
There's both. There's that, in both cases, there's deception because on the one hand, you're believing that you have this power and that you're making something happen and you're not. And on the
right,
other hand, it is possible that you have a demonic manifestation.
right.
So, and this is what,
And that's
and this
real
is
manifestation.
it's
It's
real,
that
and this is
you're really
actually,
manifesting something.
yes, and
Yeah.
thanks be to God, this is actually the point at which I started to get so afraid in my involvement with the occult that it actually led to my slow release. But I believed, I actually believed for a while that I was just like this terrible spiritual failure because I could not manifest in the way that I was trying so hard.
Mm,
I believe that I should be able to like move a pencil across the desk with my mind.
wow.
And
Wow.
um, similar things. I guess I just use that one because it sounds so ridiculous on its face, but that's a similar sort of thing. So then people get into variations of that into healing, right?
Right.
So manifesting healing,
So how do you
using,
differentiate between that and like healing prayer? Because, obviously there's a
yeah.
difference in terms of people acknowledging when they're praying for someone's healing, if they are healed, that it's from God.
Hmm.
You know, so you're kind of acting as a conduit of grace.
Yep.
Whereas, in these instances that people really are believing that they themselves are bringing about this healing. And so do you think this is just part of the delusion, that it's part of the appeal, and why so many, like for me, I look at all these women that are really using this language, and there's this desire to claim power over their lives, and like
Mm.
you see it in a lot of more of those prosperity gospel type denominations where they're claiming something, right? And
Hmm.
they're claiming a spirit, or they're claiming X, Y, and Z, and that's somehow just because God is creative and His word is creative. But that's His word. It's not our word,
It's
right?
not
Like
ours.
He
Hmm.
creates with His word. We don't.
Right.
Um,
And he has the authority.
exactly.
And there is, so this is interesting. Another, like, I keep thinking, wow, these different topics would be like another whole
I
podcast.
know. I know.
But it is important. It is important to make distinctions and to also just be conscious, be virtuous, be working, staying close to the Lord, because it's very easy, even within a Christian context, to try to take over control and to not want to relinquish it. And the most obvious difference between the two kinds of healing is that the one is Christ. Christ is healer.
Mhm.
We are not the healer. We might be the messenger. We might, he might be using us in different ways, but he is healer. We're not doing it. We're not manifesting Christ.
Right.
We are
Yeah.
in relationship with Christ. And people who are very gifted, prayerful healers, like who are in healing ministry or something like that, who are truly good at
Mhm.
what they do, uh, it is not their work, and they know it, and
Mhm.
they make that distinction, and there's invitation. They work with the person who's being prayed over. Like, it's never just, I'm going to swoop in and heal you.
Mhm.
There's a conversation, there's relationship. The person who is seeking healing is going to be also engaged in relationship with Christ. And it's just very different, from something like Reiki,
Yeah,
which
talk
is,
more about that. What is Reiki? Because I think, I look at all these things, Reiki and chakras, and I'm like, okay,
mhm.
I know this is all bad, but like, what are the differences?
So Reiki is it's like the occult version of laying on of hands. And you're using your body's energy to
And transferring it somehow.
yeah, it's in
Right?
at different levels. People have different understandings, different levels. I will say at the beginning levels of Reiki, it's more like it's more of like a manifesting as you get into the higher levels of Reiki. And this is just my experience in my community. Uh, the Reiki masters were actually communicating with their spirit guides and healing. They were like the conduit of
Mm.
the spirit guide.
It's so creepy
So
because I mean, there are salons and stuff
yeah.
that have Reiki and do chakras and things like that. I remember years ago going to get a pedicure at some salon with my mom. It was like an Aveda salon.
Hmm.
And I remember saying to my mom, like, you should not be going there. If you're going in there, you're going to the Lions Den, you better be like spraying the place down with holy water and blessed salt or something. And I mean, she was
Yeah.
totally clueless, she had no idea. And so I just wonder how many of us are unwittingly exposing ourselves and entering the lion's den for absolutely no reason.
Yes, and there's a lot of hubris. There's so much arrogance involved with that practice. Just from what I've seen, people who are into
That's
Reiki
so
are
fascinating.
extremely like they love that they can do it. They want to heal people. It's something like a source of pride. And so the people in my life, like even before I had an awareness of this stuff, even before I was understood what was going on and embraced my Christian faith, I was still uncomfortable with some people because there's
Mhm.
that approach that's like, oh, I'll just hug you, and they're hugging you, and it's like you're hugging me for a really long time.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah,
are you
please
hugging me
don't.
for a really long
Please
time?
don't.
Like, and then they'll say something, I just wanted to work on you for a minute. It's like, no, no, you don't
Please
like have
don't.
my permission. Just please
Yeah.
stop.
That's
So
super
yeah.
interesting. You talk about the arrogance component. So this salon that I went to, oh my goodness, Lord, I just all of a sudden I'm like wondering. So when I was there, I was pregnant and it was the 1 year anniversary of my sister's death. And that was like why we went. My mom had been going to the salon for a very long time. And she went and was doing something else. I was getting a pedicure. I was pregnant. And I somehow ended up with like this huge burn on the back of my leg, like horrible. And I like have sensitive skin, but like one side I didn't get a burn on, the other side I did. And I remember thinking like this is really uncomfortable, but I always feel like it's kind of uncomfortable for me when they're like lathering up with stuff and like massaging and putting who knows what on your legs before they start painting the nails and doing all that stuff. So
Yeah.
anyway, I was like, maybe it's just me. I have a pretty high pain tolerance too. So I just was like, whatever, I'll let it go. But as I stood up to leave, I was like, oh my gosh, I have like a 2nd-degree burn on the back of my leg, like a chemical burn.
Wow.
And the girl, like, she didn't really apologize. She like kind of did, and I was just shocked. So anyway, went back later and I was like, "Hey, I just wanted to file like an incident report here because I was told by a friend of mine that I should probably just do that in case something happens, or it'd be good for you guys to kind of have on record. I don't want anything. I don't want any compensation or whatever. I just think it would be worthwhile to have so that maybe you guys can avoid this in the future." And the owner was vicious, and like said I made all the stuff up, made lies up about the woman who did it, like all kinds of stuff, and left me feeling like the worst human being ever. Was like cruel about my sister dying, everything. It was
Wow.
unbelievable. And they were like, that's just not possible. There's no way that you could have gotten this burn. I still have a scar. Like it's
Wow.
never going to go away.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering, all of a sudden, I'm like, maybe there was just this spiritual component there in this building. I don't know. It was just wild, the whole thing. It's like it's not surprising at all that it's these feminist types. It's like these feminist types fall into paganism, and I feel like a lot of pagans are feminists. They're trying to
Hmm.
embrace the divine. They're trying to take control of their lives because they're told that they have no control, that like they're told that they are the weaker sex by the world or by the patriarchy. So then now they're going to try and take control of the world and do the girl boss thing on a secular and spiritual level.
Yeah.
And it makes them not nice, and like weird things are happening. I don't know.
Yeah,
It
there's
just
a
seems
there's a
really weird.
bitterness which characterizes the whole feminist movement,
Yeah.
And particularly, I think the Catholic feminist movement, and I'm not
Mm.
trying to throw everybody under the bus here. I realize that everybody's different and unique. But there's definitely like, and there are anger issues.
There's vitriol. Oh my
It's
goodness, there's so
it's
much
brutal.
vitriol.
There
And
is.
how is it like because and you bring up a really good point. We haven't even talked necessarily, and I'm not here to like name names or
No,
for
right.
anything, but when we're going and looking at some of these apostolates that are very well respected but have ties to women, Catholic women who have embraced the occult, or kind of I think of the origins of tarot cards.
Mhm.
The woman who created tarot cards, she eventually became Catholic, didn't she? Um,
I don't know
I think
the
so.
history.
That's what I've
Yeah.
heard. Was that she eventually became
Interesting.
Catholic, and so there's just this weird um, relationship, I think, here. What are your thoughts on do you have any other thoughts in addition to that, like what we're seeing within the Catholic women's, I don't know, feminist movement? Because there is a movement within, sadly, and it is very wrapped up in
Mhm.
the occult, a lot of it.
It is. I think it's complex, because there's spiritual elements, there are political elements. Very, the left is very the left in the church and feminism and in Catholicism is very tied into leftist politics. Like
Mm,
I don't know that I know any Catholic feminist who isn't involved in some sort of political advocacy.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, I think there's also a deep, deep woundedness,
Mhm.
which I think is pretty easy to see. I don't want to be arrogant about it or like make assumptions, but
Right.
I understand it to some degree because I do. Well, I know you do too. We see a lot of the abuse that happens in the name of Christ,
Mhm.
and people experience that. Women have experienced that. They've experienced abuse in different ways. I think another element is that we grow up with this. We grow into our faith. A lot of this happened to a lot of JP2 Catholics of my generation, just with these rose-colored glasses, just so enthralled and so in love with the church and so trusting of priests and so excited
Mhm.
about vocation. And then we're disappointed and hurt, and there's divorce, um, and
Well, and I
there's
think too, yeah, I mean, there's like our fathers have absconded from their roles in the home, but
Mhm,
also in our churches.
right,
And so we have this father wound, and then a lot of women didn't grow up with a mother that was very involved in an emotional way, even. So then there's this mother wound, and it's like these women. You talk about, the language that's being used right now. A lot of them are going back to take care of their inner child. You see a lot of that, and I'm not
right.
sure that's necessarily new age. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that too.
It
But
can be.
can it?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
How explain that one too, because it's like, yeah, again, like you would think, yeah, your inner child, okay, like I can see
Mhm.
myself as a child and looking at through the same eyes that I had at that time, but I don't know that I would call it my inner child.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between you're looking with compassion at your younger self and working through the wounds of family life.
Hmm.
Those things are legitimate. I think, in particular, the JP2 Center for Healing, um,
Yeah.
Dr. Bob Schutz, is that his name?
Yes.
And Sister Miriam, like they're doing phenomenal work in that area. And they're doing it in a Christ centered way, very, very rooted. But you have a lot of unmoored people as well who are finding their inner child in a way that is just like they're following mentors who are not rooted in Christ. And so you get a lot of like, uh, what is that called? Like a trying to remember what happened. I'm trying to remember the term where you go back and like through your memories and try to dig stuff up um, from
Um,
your memories. But
Not like EMDR.
no, no,
No,
no.
because
This would
that's okay,
Yeah, like
right?
having access to memories from your past that you can't remember, and going
Yeah.
through different, like if you go to, a lot of people are going to see therapists who are not reliable, and then you get into like uh seeking these things, seeking to have power over your wounds, seeking to have this healing, but using methods which are meditation that is not Christian.
Mm.
And then like manifesting, materialization. That would be another way of saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Meditating to try to become small, to get into this space as a small person, having access to memories, then moving into like past lives if somebody's receptive to that. It is just we have to be aware that the demonic is fully involved in all of this. And so when we start opening doors, we don't have to be terrified. We just have to be rooted in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But if we do start opening doors, especially to mentors, people, therapists who are not rooted in Christ, we're being sort of vulnerable to that. And I do see that, getting back to the original point. I see that a lot with these women who are leaving, and they're leaving in an angry way. They do have, in many cases, a legitimate complaint against the church,
Mm-hmm.
against people who have been in authority over them, against promises that they believe were made to them that were broken, that were not true, and they're
Mm-hmm.
devastated and hurt. And then somebody's offering them something else that's empowering and beautiful, and they've not heard this language before. They've
Mm-hmm.
always just heard like, well, just shut up and read your catechism. And so in some cases, it's an overcorrection.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of these women are incredibly intelligent and savvy and do know what they're doing. And a lot of people are just really lonely and hurting.
Mm-hmm.
And the language is appealing. It's the language of healing at first. And then it becomes like, but it's also like the language of anger. Like, I want justice for what has happened to me. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want it to happen to anybody else. This is wrong. Women are not, given our due. And then it becomes like a list of grievances. Then gratitude gets pushed aside.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just becomes like this. Well, I mean, you can see it if you go to like the Catholic feminist organizations. They all like variations of Catholic, femme. I don't know, like all of the
I
things.
know.
It's pretty. You see pretty quickly that there's an activist component to it. And I think also another element of that is that when a lot of these women have extremely compassionate, loving, sensitive hearts.
Mm-hmm.
And what they see is that people aren't being loved and taken care of. And so they turn to something other than Christ and other than the church that is they perceive to be doing a better job.
Mm.
And they see that in feminism because there's action. So, even if they like stand on at a protest, or,
Well, yeah, that's the harder thing when you're kind of doing. I mean, the work that women do so often is hidden.
yes.
And so it's harder to see that when you see women really embracing femininity because it's done quietly
Mhm.
often, which is so different than the feminist who wants justice, and not that justice, true justice with like a capital J, is bad. It's not. But it's not usually found in politics, right? Like I think even with the election that just happened, it's like you see for so many that politics is their religion.
Yeah.
It's this unwillingness to assent to the timeless truths and teachings of the Catholic Church. And in a way, we want the church to conform to us and our views, which is the exact opposite of faith. And so it would mean naturally then that if you don't have true faith in the institution of which you are a part of, you seek and rest your faith in other things because we are naturally religious creatures that place our faith in something. And sometimes it's within ourselves,
Mhm.
but often it's from without as well. We're always seeking because that's just a part of our nature. We seek God, and sometimes we find him truly where he is in his beautiful church. And then other times while we're seeking, we find this mirage of God
Eh,
or
Yeah.
something totally different.
And that's the answer to why do they fall so easily into the occult? Because
Yeah,
they're still
because it seems.
spiritual. They're still really sensitive, spiritual people.
Mm,
And if they're not going to find it in the church and they're not going to find it in Christ, they're going to look for it somewhere else. And
well,
and, and I was there, like I feel like I started on the other side so I can be like, oh, hey, wait,
yeah.
I've been there. Like the answer is not there, even if we have struggles here and there is injustice, there absolutely is, and there is abuse, and there's so much sinfulness and woundedness in the world. But
Mhm.
that way, like, the answer is not where you're seeking it. It's not there.
So why do you think women are more prone to it seems to me that women are more prone to this than perhaps men are. Do you
Mhm.
think it's because we tend to be more emotive and more receptive to things that are spiritual than say men are?
I do. I think it's the fact that we are, our glory really is in this beautiful service. Pope John Paul called it the feminine genius, right? To
Mhm.
serve is to reign. And I know that the feminists
Amen.
balk at
Yeah.
that because
Yeah.
they're like, well, this is just part of the system that wants to keep us, wants to shut
But
us up. And it's like, no,
they're still
yeah,
serving, they're serving a
right,
different system.
right.
It's like they don't see that. They're still serving somebody. It's just not God, and it's not their husband, and it's not their children.
It's
It's
true.
really yeah, I mean, they're still serving a boss. They're still serving themselves. They're still they will always be at service to somebody.
Right. And that's that caregiver part of them. Like I think with the politics, the political side of it. We
Yeah,
want to take care of the poor. We want to take care of, and ironically, it ends up with being supporting abortion, which is,
I know.
is that's a demonic component. I think
Mhm.
that's a blindedness that can only be explained spiritually, I think.
Mhm.
Ultimately, because even with what happened in California yesterday, like some ridiculous percentage of the voting population voted that you can now kill a baby all the way up to birth. Like, what is that people aren't thinking, or they
It's
they have
legal
that
here in
blindness?
Minnesota to
Is it?
be yes, they're all 9 months, and it is pretty much a part of our state constitution.
Wow.
Yeah, and people it's like everyone wants to think it's not them, it's not their state, it's not their community,
Right.
and it is. Like, more often than not, it is.
Right.
And I think, yeah, I mean, it's just so weird. I mean, even talking about this aspect of women labor and delivery nurses or OB-GYNs who are delivering children in one room and then killing them in another room in the
Yes.
same day, and you're like,
This is
"How do you do that?"
the bizarre world of birth.
Yes, yeah, and you're a doula, so I mean,
It's
that's
so bizarre. I
yeah.
actually, like, going through my doula training, I saw in real time Christian pro-life women become pro-abortion.
What?
I watched it happen. They were not equipped to be able to handle the arguments from emotion. So, they were presented with this idea. I'm trying to remember, it was a while ago, but it was like they'd be presented with a situation like, if a woman comes to you and she's alone and she's broken and she's terrified and she doesn't have anybody to go with her through this process, are you telling me that you would leave her at the door, that you would reject her when she is at her lowest point and she's about to get this abortion because she feels she has nowhere to go, and you're just going to let her walk into that building without anybody to hold her hand? And
Yep.
these Christian women are like, oh, no, like they couldn't handle it even for 5 minutes. They couldn't work through this process. And I have compassion for that because I saw it happen. I'm like, I'm watching the conversations and going, wow, that's overwhelming, especially for somebody who hasn't had any really good formation. Um, they're here in doula training to support women. That's like the primary
Right.
purpose. And they're saying, no, I'm not going to hold a space for this broken woman. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to leave her at the door. And that's when they shifted. They said, I have to be able to do
It's
both.
a false dichotomy,
It
though.
is.
It's a false
Absolutely.
dichotomy, and that's the thing that's so disingenuous about all of this, but you look kind of bringing it all together, you look at the language and you look at how susceptible women are to the syncretizing of these pagan feminist ideologies of embracing the divine feminine and all of the feminine energies and that not
Mhm.
always that's bad, but I mean there is definitely another component to that. Again, it's like all this nuance, um, and it seems to me we live in a time where women, we were all endowed with an intellect and a will, and women have and Dr. Alice von Hildebrand talks about this so much in the
She's
or
so good. That
privilege
book
of
is
being a
so
woman.
good.
It's so good. But it's like she talks so much about this, how women we have this tendency, and you and I have talked about it too, like we get caught up in our emotions and we become unhinged from the intellect,
Yeah.
and that's what you see within all of these things, because when you're using your intellect, you can reason a lot of these things, especially embracing paganism and embracing femininity. You don't have to embrace paganism to embrace being feminine,
No.
or embrace living out a godly life. But we have to use our brains. We can't get caught up in our emotions and this desire to have control over everything. Like, we're human. We're not actually designed to have control over everything. That's not how God made us. He made us dependent, like babies. He
Yeah.
made us babies to be dependent on one another and on him ultimately. Like, that's our nature. That's his design, not our own. And instead we use all of these emotional things. We get caught up in all this emotional language, whether we realize it or not, to seek control and to manifest and do all these weird things, because
Yeah.
we're so out of control.
And
Like, our
it's
hearts are so out
ultimately
of control.
and ultimately it's a lack of trust in our Lord too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because we just don't believe he's going to get it done anymore. We have
Mm-hmm.
to take it back. And
And
we
we're
all struggle with
impatient.
that. We're impatient. And
We're
then
so
the other thing is that we tend to fall away from prayer. Like, we all have that tendency. Maybe not all, maybe there's some people who don't ever have that tendency.
mm-hmm.
Um, but especially in times of great stress, the inclination is toward action
Mm-hmm.
and not contemplation. And we have, because of the technology, because of our busyness, because of our phones, because of our, the podcast that we listen to all the time, people should
Mm-hmm.
listen to this one though.
Oh.
But, like, we fill our spaces to the
Yeah.
degree that we don't leave room for that silence and that contemplation. Once we have done that, then we have cut ourselves off from our lifeline, because
Mm-hmm.
the whole of the Christian life really centers around intimacy with our Lord.
Yeah.
If we do not have that connection and that intimacy with our Lord, then we will lose our moorings. Like, what did the priest, the one priest I heard speak said, he can always tell when a priest is in trouble because he stopped praying his breviary,
Mm-hmm.
or when he's at risk, at a higher risk. And
Yeah.
that's true for all of us. Like, where has the language of the Spirit gone? So these women who have gone off the rails, gotten into the occult, gotten really into like leftist politics, looking at their posts that are public, things that we can see. Obviously, we can't see their hearts and their personal lives. What we can see, where in that, all of that, is the Spirit manifesting? And I'm using that word correctly.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the Spirit moves as he will. So where is that language? Where is that love affair with Christ? Where can it
Mm.
be found? And oftentimes you can feel it, kind of see it if we have that sensibility. And oftentimes we can see it because we know our own weakness, right? Like, I know when
Mhm.
I'm not praying, and when
Yeah.
I'm having struggles, and you can just see it sliding. And then to replace it, there's the sort of this politicized faith.
Or two, they like almost they take God, the Christian God, out of it. I mean,
Yeah.
referring to God only as the creator.
Yes.
Have you noticed that too?
Mhm.
It's just the creator. It kind of goes back to that universal type thing where it's like God is no longer the Christian God Yahweh. All of a sudden, he's the creator,
Mhm.
with no name, no personalization.
And isn't that what yoga and all of the new age stuff
Yes.
orients? It is depersonalizing. It is taking that relationship out of it. And I don't, man, if I could just open this up and really have the opportunity to talk to people, that would be wonderful, because truly this, I think it would be relatively easy for some of us who haven't, it's easy to get off track a little
Mhm.
bit with language and stuff like that.
For sure.
But to be able to come back and see the faith and our actions in light of our faith, all the things that we do in this relational way, like, people are saying, well, I can filter out what I don't like in yoga, or I can filter that stuff out. I know enough. And okay, that's fair. Like we have to filter all the time, right? So they may choose to change it up or discard some things, but at that point, I would just like to ask, like, why not do something else? Like, we're not filters, we're temples.
Mm,
And we
right.
belong to a loving God who is deserving of all that we have for his glory and our healing and salvation. That is what, and that is all about this familial relationship, like this intimacy with our Lord. The further we get away from that, like the more we're just filled with the anger, the bitterness, the replacing of Christ and his sacraments and prayer with activism. Not that, like obviously some activism has its place.
Hmm.
Um, Not that we should never do any of those things, but in this particular way. This
Well, and I
angry
think
feminist occult kind of stuff, like they're just replacing it. Like you
right. And I think couching it in the terms of like really us being a family is so important because it goes back, it ties in with that earlier point that you made kind of towards the beginning of this interview. But like a lot of this stuff really seeks to depersonalize, but to treat everything as like this big body of like nothingness. But,
Mhm.
it's like it all just melts together into this big divine idea kind of.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
it seems like a respite because we're all in pain, and so we
yes,
wanna disconnect from those things which cause us pain, and the things which cause us pain are all these temporal things we're touching on, right?
right. But we are
So, yeah.
persons, and, God desires a relationship with each of us distinctly, uniquely, and He designed us each differently, but all to give glory to Him in our own way. And that means we have to start there. Like we each have to look to Him individually and not look at these, I don't know, these ambiguous things that sort of make us feel good for a short time, but aren't rooted in something truly eternal, right?
Right. Mhm.
Yeah. So, if you could sum up kind of like one or two things, what are the first things you tell people to like pay attention to specifically? And where can people learn more about these things? I know kind of you talk about it on your own Substack from time to
Yeah.
time, and
Mhm.
you even seems like years later are still kind of uncovering some of the ways in which you were caught up in the occult without maybe even realizing it. It sounds like you've been kind of still doing that hard work of peeling back the layers.
It's a lot of layers, and the Lord is really gentle with us.
Yes. Amen.
Sometimes it hurts like a scab being ripped off, but he knows, like he knows the timing and what we need. And it's been really beautiful. I'm just so grateful. Like he's so gracious and so tender. And I'm learning through my own healing, um, just feeling really lately compelled toward that tenderness. Like I'm not that good at it. I'm saying that I'm
I get
feeling
it.
really drawn to imitate him in that tenderness because I'm just overwhelmed by what he's done. But I would say, um, like how your question was, how do we identify?
Yeah. Yep. What are some of the things
Yeah,
that you would say would help people the most
I
to
would say that
identify?
the number one thing is to become a person of contemplation and prayer, and to learn real Catholic meditation. I definitely recommend, just focusing on personal holiness in that way, and not just like I'm going to knock out all the novenas and stuff like that. There's a place for that, but I mean seeking real intimacy with our Lord. And
Do
there are
Lectio
lots,
Divina. That's like
yeah,
my
do
for
Lectio
me
Divina.
is like, yeah.
There are such really good resources out there. I know, oh, what is it called? Dan Burke's organization. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, oh my goodness,
Spiritualdirection.com.
spiritualdirection.com. Yep.
They do really good work. In fact, they also have a really great article on there by Father Ezra Sullivan about yoga.
I'll
So
link it.
it's a several part series. I encourage everybody to look that up on the
It'll be
website.
in the description, so you
Okay.
can find it there.
Yeah. There's a couple documents from the church that you can use for study. One is the letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church on some aspects of Christian meditation, and that's by the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. And the other one on, like some new age stuff. And I think they might mention yoga. Jesus Christ, the bearer of the water of life. And that is by the Pontifical Council for Culture and the Pontifical Council for Interreligious. And of course, the scriptures. So steeped in prayer, steeped in scripture, and good spiritual reading. And by doing those things, what we're doing is we're developing like our sense of the holy, our sense of the good. And then our discernment will be so much clearer. We'll be able to say, like, I don't know, like sometimes I'll have gone to mass in different places that I'm not used to. And I'm thinking, well, I would really love, like, where's St. Paul here?
Yeah.
Like, I want to hear somebody preach like St. Paul, really missing that right now. Like, if we're steeped in Christ and his word, then we get to missing it, and we get to identifying things that are like, that's really interesting. And we can ask the question, what do you mean by that? Let's clarify. What do you mean by that word exactly? And you'll find that a lot of people won't be able to tell you, actually.
And they'll probably just attack you instead.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, if you
that's
say,
been my experience, is like you
yes.
question and they just
Right.
jump on you. It's like, okay, but you still
Right.
didn't ask. You didn't answer my question at all.
Right.
So
Like you can ask with manifesting.
Yeah, manifest. I mean,
but in a
any of that stuff,
non-confrontational way, just like a really, if it's important to you, and if this person is somebody in your life, you maybe are discerning, you want to keep there. Can you please explain to me what you mean by manifesting? I'm not sure. There are lots of different ways that people are using it. How are you using it? I would really like to know. That might be a good way. And a lot of ambiguous language, when people use terms like manifesting, divine feminine. I'm sorry, I'm like trying to think of other ones, and there's so many.
There's so many.
There's so many. But even something like greatness, like with the girl boss thing, everybody's, I want to help lead you or coach you to greatness. Well, ask the question, what do you mean by greatness? Because there's something really specific that I believe about greatness. And what do you mean? So where are you taking me? And if you're going to take me anywhere away from the church, or away from what, from Christ, I want to know where you're going. So that's a good one. That greatness is a word that's used a lot.
Yes, I'm looking at one website. I think I did send it to you, but it's like, your genius is the portal to our collective paradigm shift.
Oh, yeah.
Your inner child is holding the keys, and it's time to empower her, speaking in that sort of disconnected, depersonalized way. It's time to connect her to unlock your power and wisdom. Which, you're like, yeah, that depersonalized, like, you're not just you were a child, you are still that same person. You know what I mean? So yeah.
So that's kind of lacking. That's lacking a bit of clarity. It's like, well, what do you mean by all of those things?
Right.
I don't know what you mean.
Oh, so good. So people can find you, though, and your excellent work and your Substack and all that stuff as this. What's your Substack title? I should know this.
It's the Wild Return.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, the Wild Return. You wrote the Sunshine Principle, where you kind of document coming back into healing through God's design, right? God's design for healing. And then, you're very active on Instagram and things like that as well. And you've been a very outspoken advocate against some of the crazy mandates over the last couple of years. Your Instagram was locked down for a long time,
9
thanks
months,
to our beautiful technocrats.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
But I mean, so everyone, Melody's got some, she's been doing battle for some time now.
You can go to my website is theessentialmother.com, and you can get to my social media and my Substack from there.
Perfect.
So that might be easier.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely make sure everyone is able to connect with you over there. I'll be posting those in the description as well for anyone who's more interested in connecting with you and your amazing work. Thanks again for coming on to Integrated for the second time. And I look forward to having so many more of these conversations with you in the future.
This is really fun. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much.